And today I am delighted to be joined by the eminent cultural historian, academic, author and political commentator Philip Caselli, who has found himself investigated for wrongthink. He is now a senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, and it is a delight to have him on Outspoken. Philip, thank you so much for being here today. What did you make of Keir Starmer's reaction in Northern Ireland yesterday, which yet again was to shut down any discussion about why there might be discontent on the streets of Britain, and instead to decry anyone really who feels discontent, certainly any of the folk who have been arrested and about to be locked up for posting a meme, a political meme? He simply declared them racist.
Yes, indeed. Well, Dan, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show. It really makes you think, doesn't it, that the first thing you should do when you think about wrongdoing, crime, people who are acting out of character, the first thing you should do is ask why. But that is precisely what the government is not doing. They're not interested in why these things are happening, why people like Julie Sweeney, who's never done anything wrong in her life, is a 53-year-old carer from Cheshire, for God's sake, why she all of a sudden is taking to Facebook and typing crazy, ridiculous, awful things. Sure. But what's going on there? What's happening with her? It's the same in Ireland. I mean, we know that Ireland is changing so rapidly. The cultural change in Ireland is happening at such a rate of knots that people can't keep up. And the truth is, the stark reality is, people are frightened and people are angry. And when you get that combination and you don't listen, the only thing you do is threaten them. It's as you said before, Dan, it can't end well. These things never end well. We look, you can see precedents throughout recent history, actually. When people aren't listened to, they act up. These threats are so extreme that, as you've said, even Elon Musk is taking notice of them and saying that they're all Orwellian. We are moving towards an Orwellian society. One of the things that we really want, I think, and one of the things that these people want is, one, to be listened to, okay, one, to take their concerns seriously, but also to live in the real world. Because what we're not dealing with reality. What Keir Starmer is reacting to is something that frankly isn't real. These people aren't racist. The far right doesn't have any kind of political footing in this country. It hasn't done for years and years and years. There's no force like the National Front or the BNP anymore. People are just frightened and fed up of ridiculously quick cultural change, and they're fed up of not being listened to.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. And of course, there are going to be real consequences to this decision by Starmer. And let's just be frank, even though the judiciary is meant to be separate from the executive in a Westminster system, we know that it is the clear direction from Starmer, former director of public prosecutions, that is seeing people like Julie Sweeney being locked up. That is going to have a consequence, because we've already seen evidence, Philip, that these criminals, these career criminals who are about to be released early from prison, and actually some of them are not even being jailed at all, even though they have more than 100 convictions, they are already reoffending at higher rates. So actually, society is just going to get more unsafe because of this decision by Starmer to crack down on behaviour by the English working classes.
I mean, this is it echoes other things that are happening in society. When you give me that scenario there, essentially it's a safeguarding scenario, isn't it? What are you going to do? Are you going to put your politics and identity politics first and say, well, let's get rid of these people we don't want and let's put them in prison? The only way we can really seriously do that, because our prisons are massively overcrowded, is to just let people out. And essentially, that's what they're doing. In the clip you showed before, there was no sense of a serious response to safeguarding. And it makes me think of all the other things that the radical left are pushing through the agenda of our culture at the moment. And I'm thinking particularly about gender, the trans agenda, and education. Okay. There are two things there that's happening. One is affirmation and the other is safeguarding. Affirmation is completely overriding safeguarding. And what we're getting now is this in the criminal justice system. Okay. So my fear, Dan, is that when something dreadful happens, when these people who should be in prison are out of prison and the people who shouldn't be in prison are in prison, when people really get hurt outside and inside, they are not going to acknowledge it. They are not going to do anything about it. Things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. We're stumbling towards real crisis here. And I hear myself talking about this, and I've talked about it on other platforms and other shows. And I think to myself, am I over egging the omelette here? Am I being over the top? And no, I'm not, because the facts are there. We're having criminals being taken out of prison so innocent people can be put in prison. And when I say innocent, yes, okay, they've committed crimes. They've said things on Facebook that they shouldn't say, and maybe they should be punished for it. Okay, I'm okay with that, but they shouldn't be going to prison. Julie Sweeney shouldn't be going to prison.
No,
and it isn't just
they
have
been humiliated on a national scale. They feel deeply embarrassed by what they have written. But surely we should live in a society where, unless you are specifically inciting violence against an individual or an actual place, then you should be able to say whatever you want on social media. Now, look, if the individual platforms which are privately owned decide to remove you, I guess that is a separate conversation. But in terms of criminalizing controversial speech, and the left are loving this at the moment, but be very careful, because this is a slippery slope, and it's a slippery slope into totalitarianism.
I think what's going to happen is, and again, this is one of those things that I never would have said 2 or 3 years ago, but I find myself saying quite a lot now. We are slipping into totalitarianism, and I think what's going to happen is the authorities, and that's how I think of them, the authorities. I think what's going to happen there is that they're going to look at retrospectively at what we've said on Twitter and on Facebook and on, God help us, on television and platforms like this. And they're going to say, and they're going to come to us and say, you said this in 2021, you said this in 2022. It's going to be retrospective. We are in a kind of cultural revolution here, a form of cultural revolution, which is in a way the antithesis of the 60s. That was the last big cultural revolution. What we're seeing here is this, it's not a slippery slope. We're hurtling towards.
Yeah, we're there.
Right.
After 6 weeks.
Yeah, we're hurtling towards
after 6 weeks.
Yeah. I think one of the things is people don't realize. I mean, my father was Hungarian, and when I grew up, I used to go back to Hungary in the 1980s when I was a little boy, and I saw it. I saw the regime there. I saw the anger and fear on people's faces. People wouldn't say anything in public, but as soon as they got behind closed doors, they said it all, and they resented the regime and they hated the regime. And that's what's going to happen here. Don't forget, Starmer and the government is kowtowing to a minority. The majority think as we do, okay? The minority is the loud, vocal, obnoxious minority. These are the people that work in universities, Dan. These are the people...
You know about them.
I know about them. These are the people who work in media. You know about them too,
oh, yes.
Okay? So they're a minority, okay? And they're vocal. The silent majority is doing nothing. And my fear is that if they carry on doing nothing, it's going to be too late, because once you start down this slippery slope, there's a point of no return. And when you get to that point of no return, I think we're very close to it. When you get to that point of no return in terms of totalitarianism, things move very, very quickly.
Yeah, and they are moving quickly. And actually, I wanted to point out some of the protests that are going on, because of course people are very nervous. They're very nervous to be on the streets. They're very nervous to post on social media platforms. But folk like Douglas Murray and Father Calvin Robinson, who will be here tomorrow, are encouraging English people to continue to get on the streets as long as the protests stay peaceful. But it's a fine line, isn't it? So I want to show you an example of some folk who did that in Bournemouth.
None! I don't want them! I can't have one! My house! Refugees don't welcome it anymore!
And again, Philip, I would say there's quite a fine line there, because actually, under this new Orwellian approach, actually, is it considered hate speech? Is it considered inappropriate if folk yelling refugees are not welcome here? But I wanted to point out and link that clip to a post on X of yours that I was quite taken by, where you asked how you felt about being in Labour's Britain in 2024, but you said that you were up for the fight. You said there have been times of late when I've had no fight in me. In January, for example, I didn't care about anything. I couldn't see a future for myself, let alone anyone else. So I understand why people feel so bloody down about authoritarianism, doublethink, censorship, cancellation, victimization, and racist identity politics. We have no choice, though. We can't let the most moronic regime in British history get away with it, nor can we ignore the loons cheering from the sidelines. So given that's how you feel, and I think that's great, and by the way, as you know, we've gone through a very similar experience over the past year in terms of being cancelled and coming back, and in some ways, actually, it's a liberation, isn't it? Because once you are cancelled, you actually have far less to lose in some ways. But what should ordinary folk do who are sitting at home, nervous now about whether to even make a post on Facebook, nervous about whether they can go to a protest march? What can they do?
Okay, well, first of all, what they shouldn't do is get sacked and end up on the dole for the next 30 years. Okay, I think that's, they've got to be careful. And so what we have to do is we have to think of ways, of strategies and methods of protest which actually work. Okay, and I think we need to be able to know at a particular moment, because this will change all the time, what the line is, how far we can push it. Okay, and I think we need to be able to fight back and say, I was just looking at that clip that you've just posted there, Dan. Okay, that's people waving flags of St. George, okay, and chanting. Think about all of the Saturday hate marches in London and all over the country. People waving Palestinian flags, people waving signs with the Star of David being put in a bin, absolute gross anti-Semitism every week since October the 7th.
And no action taken.
This is a response to a pogrom. Okay, so I think we have to bear that in mind. And I think one of the things that people have to do is they just have to learn, and they have to read, and they have to understand what's going on. And we need to be able to take a lead in that, I think, people who are public figures, who are commentators, and we need to be able to be clever, like Douglas Murray, like Jordan Peterson. And we really need to be able to twist the narrative and show the lies that are happening. And, you know, I'll be out there waving a flag of St. George. I'm more than happy to do that. And I'm happy to stand my ground. And I think if many of us do it, and we do it sensibly, and we don't break the law, they can't lock us all up. The point is, we mustn't be silenced. And it's as I said in that tweet, it's really easy to be despondent and downhearted. You and I know we've been through pretty rough times. I mean, yours was much worse than mine, but there were times in January where I thought I had no future. I thought I couldn't afford to pay my mortgage. I thought I was finished in my career. And I actually visited a car park. I wasn't going to throw myself off the top of it, but I spoke about this in a speech to the New Culture Forum. I was incredibly depressed because I just couldn't see a future for myself. I think generally people feel that way about British culture. It feels as though we're taking something beautiful, we're taking something that we built for generations and generations, and it seems we're throwing it out and replacing it with crap. And we must be able to rally ourselves and be able to speak in public in a way that's effective. And that isn't throwing abuse, and that isn't, saying the things that people have been saying on Facebook that they've got locked up for. What we should be doing is being clever and being angry and putting our fear aside.
Yeah, I agree. Very, very inspiring, that. But one of the problems is, Philip, we know how entrenched the two-tier justice is under this new government. And I want to talk about this appalling Home Office post on X, which showed the faces of a number of folk who had been arrested over the course of the so-called rioting. There you can see it, which had the headline, "These criminals will feel the full force of the law." Now, of course, that is completely outrageous for a government department to be posting something like that on social media, given that no justice has yet been done. The vast majority of the people in that photo have presumably not been to court, certainly not been found guilty. And as Lee Anderson, the Reform UK MP, wrote on X, "Innocent until proven guilty." Well, it appears not since Labour took charge. Check this tweet from the Home Office sent out last week, which in my opinion is disgraceful. Then check out my letter to the Home Secretary. "We cannot allow the state to assume anyone's guilt until they've had a fair trial. They are not criminals until they've been found guilty. Hopefully our judges will see through this." And sure enough, Lee Anderson has written to the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, making this point. But Philip, to me, what this shows is just how much in lockstep Slippery Starmer's government is going to be with the Blob, the Civil Service. And it's terrifying.
It's really frightening. First of all, we don't live in France. Okay, we're not guilty before we're proven innocent. It's the other way around. Yeah. So I'm so appalled that the Home Office has said this, but the really, really appalling thing is that I'm not surprised at all. Right, I'm not surprised at all that they will do that, because if you think about it, it's not just about two-tier policing, is it? It's about two-tier everything. Okay, so if you have certain political opinions, you are a second-class citizen. It's getting more and more the case that if you are, white, male, heterosexual, and middle-aged, then by God, you really are a second-class citizen. And there are so many of us. If you are working class, you're a second-class citizen. There are so many of us. We're not just getting two-tier policing, we're getting two-tier everything. And this is one of the things that I think we really need to make a stand on and fight back against. So many people have just said, well, I'm not paying the BBC license fee, for example, because they hate me, right? The BBC hates me. So I don't want anything to do with the mainstream media. I'm not paying the license fee. There are platforms like this, there are platforms like New Culture Forum and all of those things. I can get all my news and it's unfiltered and it's much more accurate here. That's one thing, okay? The second thing is, if you're getting two-tier policing, then you're getting two-tier education, you're getting two-tier council, you're getting two-tier, local government, you're getting everything. So stop en masse, maybe, paying your council tax. That might be a really important thing to do. Hit them where it hurts. Why should I pay the same as everybody else when I'm being treated differently, when I'm considered guilty before I'm proven innocent?
No, indeed. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the political climate, right now it feels like there is no official opposition. The Conservative Party has gone missing. And so it is Reform UK that I believe, is representing how most ordinary folk feel. As a result, you will be aware, Philip, that the mainstream media has become obsessed with bringing down Nigel Farage. He's been criticised in the most strident terms again today because he's going to go to the US for the second time since becoming the MP for Clacton as the keynote speaker at this Saturday's Keep Arizona Free Summit. Of course, the mainstream media also furious that he's been paid an upfront deposit of nearly £12,000 for the speech. But we have a two-tier media in this country, don't we, Philip? Because it's the weekend, number one. Number two, there are MPs travelling around the world for spurious reasons all the time. And I have a feeling the people of Clacton will be pretty proud of the fact that Nigel Farage is such a big deal in the US. But what do you make of the witch hunt against Farage at the moment?
Well, it just in the latest iteration of this, the latest wave, it started immediately the day after Hare Hills, didn't it? You remember the riots at Hare Hills in Leeds. And I just live really quite near there. And then Alex Sobel, the Labour MP, immediately the day after started blaming Nigel Farage for it. And then we got this ridiculous narrative where all of a sudden Nigel Farage was stirring up social media, so it's all his fault. So we go from this very frightening civil unrest, which we need to talk about and we need to understand. We need to get to the root of what's going on there. No, none of that. It's the same old thing. We just go to the narrative and it's goodies versus baddies. It's a Manichaean evil versus goodness narrative that we always have. And you just need to pick the villain, okay? And Nigel Farage is always the villain. You know, he hasn't done anything. He was nowhere near there. He was perfectly within his rights as an MP to respond to the outrageous stuff that was going on the street. And yet they just take all of the important stuff away, all of the things that they should be analysing and thinking about and discussing. No, they just move it to Nigel Farage. But the worst thing is they had the Green Councillor of Hare Hills, who's an Islamist and a sectarian. Okay, and immediately the mainstream media are making him out to be a hero. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So you've got a fairy tale version of current affairs, and it's frightening because it's so simplistic. Okay, it isn't the real world. This is what I was saying before, and I think we've both had a taste of this. We're not even talking about policy. We're not even talking about politics. We're talking at the most basic level of what's going on, and are we seeing the same thing? Because 2 days or 24 hours after something happens that's a major event that we should all be concerned about, the narrative moves onto something that is completely different, and it's almost as if it's never happened.
Yeah, totally.
So this idea of I'm concerned about reality. What's going on here?
Absolutely. This is something I have been so conscious of for a long time, and it especially happens any time that there's a tragic event, usually involving some form of Islamist terrorism. Immediately, the authorities and politicians will say after the event, this isn't the time to discuss this, we've got to grieve. So you grieve for a few days. By that point, the police say, well, of course you can't talk about what's going on because we're investigating this. Then the perpetrator is charged. And of course, you legally can't talk about it because of contempt of court. By the time said person has got to court and been found guilty, the world's moved on. And what it means is that we never actually have the discussions that we need. And instead, Philip, we're having ridiculous discussions like this in the Daily Telegraph today. Welsh warned over racist buildings. Staff will be instructed in critical whiteness studies. Joanna Williams posted about this. There's something medieval about this declaration that buildings bear the mark of original sin and must be avoided or ritually cleansed with formulaic statements. But as ridiculous as it sounds, this is the sort of thing that the Labour administration are going to be focusing on. It's woke tyranny, isn't it?
It's woke tyranny, and we shouldn't be surprised because they've signalled this for years and years and years. Remember when the countryside, for example, was racist? What they're doing here is they are pathologizing the bricks and mortar of our own culture. They are presenting a history that is, again, a fairy tale. It's one-sided. It's a saga of woe, and the whole scenario is just so absurd, isn't it? You imagine these Welsh librarians thinking, "Oh, well, what building are we going to meet in? We're going to meet in this primary school. Oh, we can't. The primary school's racist." It's absurd. We know it's absurd. But my fear is that we get used to this. We get used to these stories coming time after time after time, and they become normalized, and we don't do anything about it. We must remember, again, this is the fight back that I'm thinking about very seriously, okay? Every time we see one of these stories, we really have to push back, because it is the pathologization of our culture, and it's bricks and mortar. If the bricks and mortar go, if the buildings go, if the listed building, I'm in a listed building now, if this goes, that's part of our collective memory will disappear, and that's part of our identity. It's so important. As a cultural historian, this kind of stuff really sends a shiver down my spine, because it's obliteration. That's all it is. It's obliteration.
It is. Obliteration, a great word. What I love is that there is one man in the comedy world who is pulling all of this madness together at the moment, Andrew Lawrence, and he has done a brilliant job mocking and pillaring Starmer's performance in Northern Ireland that we started the show with. Let's have a watch.
White working class people are intolerable. They've been brainwashed by misinformation, they're clearly racist, and they do not represent the modern, forward-looking Islamic caliphate that I know that this country can be. So I'm very pleased to be locking them all up. I'm proud to tell you that 2,000 prisoners are going to be released in a single day next month. I'm releasing these prisoners in the interests of public safety. Sex offenders, violent criminals will be released en masse to create vital space for white working class protesters who've been angrily waving Union Jacks about, stealing flip-flops from Shoe Zone, sausage rolls from Greggs, bath bombs from Lush, or quite simply writing naughty things on the internet. So far, we've arrested more than 1,000 people for complaining about mass uncontrolled immigration, and we're just getting started. And I'm here to tell you that if you want to commit any real crime, now is your opportunity, because our police and judicial system are far too busy arresting and handing out prison sentences to my political opponents to worry about actual criminals.
So surreal, but so brilliant, isn't it, Philip?
Well, I see it, and it's one of those things. It's just so accurate. You know, I'm looking at Starmer, and more I'm seeing this automaton that is just speaking and delivering this ideology and this identitarian politics, which so few of us buy into, and most of us are genuinely frightened of or angry about. You know, so I think that one of the real weapons, you know, we're talking about fighting back, and a lot of this interview has been about fighting back. How do we do that? Okay. One of the weapons we've got is humor, satire, you know, sending this kind of stuff up, and we've got to do it
because it is ridiculous.
And also because you may have noticed over the last 10, 15 years that humor and comedy on the mainstream media just isn't funny anymore.
Nope.
That's the major problem. So it's great that we are getting comedians and satirists who are sending up the people who need to be.
Let's reclaim it.
As opposed to led by donkeys who can only send up the Tory party for 5 years.
And are very unfunny. And what we need is some of that American attitude, because you're completely right. If you look over the pond, it was Dave Chappelle that actually finally proved how ridiculous trans extremism was. It was the South Park creators that finally proved to the world how ludicrous Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are. And on that note, actually, Philip, do stand by, because I also want to bring in now our royal mastermind, Angela Levin, to talk about the other big breaking story today. It is connected, though, of course. King Charles arrived in Southport for the first time after the massacre. And this was a very significant visit, given that we remember the last time one of our leaders was in Southport, and I'll show you the footage later, but Keir Starmer was very badly heckled. So what response was the monarch going to get during this visit today? Well, take a look at this. And then as he went to meet the public, some of them actually yelled out to him, "Thank you for coming." Watch. Now, you couldn't get a more stark contrast to what happened to Starmer when he showed up in Southport. Watch this.
How many more children are dying in our streets, Prime Minister? How many more children? How many more children, Prime Minister? Are we going to do something?
Time to change, Starmer.
Come on, it's needed. How many more children? Is it mine next? What's shameful? Bye-bye. You got your photos, off you go. Make a real change, Prime Minister. Make a real change! Our children! Go away!
I just found out my friend's 9-year-old daughter.
So, Angela Levin, great to have you. Look, I'm not comparing Charles to Starmer. Of course, they are very different figures in public consciousness. However, this was still a bit of a risky visit for the monarch today. He will be delighted with that reaction.
Well, I mean, I think you do see that you can be compassionate whatever job you've got. The fact that he was in and out in 1 minute and just take that time to put some flowers down is actually appalling. He didn't speak to anybody. You don't have to be a prime minister to actually show compassion. But the king is somebody who is very compassionate and he feels for it. He times it very well as well. Royals don't go straight away after there has been something terrible happening because they feel they get in the way and the police have to look after them or guard them rather than anything else. But he's waited his time. It's now calmed down slightly and he went. And the reception was wonderful because they do care. They do want, I mean, we do want our royals to help us in difficulty. We've seen it with the late Queen, and King Charles is the same, that you care about individuals and they are your subjects and you need to show that. And he does it very well. He seemed actually to be quite fit. He walked up the stairs very quickly. He looked quite well. And when somebody asked him, "How are you, sir?" he said, "I'm not too bad." So that's being careful. You know, not what not too bad is, but, you know, he obviously wasn't going to say, but he means well. And I think he did very well. And he's going to invite the 3 families whose daughters died to London and to the palace. And I think that's also a marvellous gesture, because although you can't bring these children back and you can't ever get over the pain, that you can think that somebody very important is taking the trouble to help you, and you can see, the palace, which you would never do that before. And Camilla is also very good at talking to people who've had terrible problems, and they can feel some sort of comfort, which they very much deserve.
Yes, you're right. It's tomorrow, actually, that he's going to be meeting with the family members of the 3 young girls who tragically lost their lives after being killed in that barbaric manner. So that will happen, as you say, at the palace. I believe some folk are also meeting Taylor Swift at her concert in London tonight, because of course the dance class was a Taylor Swift themed class. Philip, what did you make of the reception that Charles got today and the contrast between his time in Southport and Starmer's time?
Well, I thought it was actually very moving. I was just watching the footage there, and I felt myself, get quite emotional about it. There's something about that connection between monarch and people, and we saw it. We just saw it there. We saw the essence of it. It's so lovely to see such a positive exchange on the streets, and as you say, Dan, the juxtaposition, the contrast with Starmer, who just marched in and marched out, was something to behold. Now, I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and we had a discussion on the New Culture Forum about what should the king do, and should there be a royal intervention of any kind. And I think they've got it just right. It's a gesture that's very personal, that's about individuals and that's about people. It wasn't. I was frightened that he was going to make a speech or something. It just seemed as though it was, as Angela says, perfectly timed, and everything about it. I was just proud of it, basically.
I agree.
Can I just say, the only thing he said that we could hear was, "Aren't these flowers wonderful? And it's so lovely to see them, and all the teddies." Oh, you do. I felt, really tearful on that.
Yeah.
But straight to the heart.
But I'm also proud of Charles for listening to advice, because this is why the late Queen Elizabeth II was so wonderful, right? But we do know, Angela, as Philip points out, he was considering giving a speech. I think that would have waded into a very thorny political area, especially after he criticised the Rwanda scheme. We know where he stands on the issue of immigration. Actually, this was pitch perfect. You don't need to say much. You need to be a unifying figure, and today he was.
Yeah. I think he was wonderful. And I think that he might have been in pain, he might have been exhausted, but it was nothing about him. He didn't start telling you about him. He just wanted to be close to his subjects. And for that, we're very grateful.
Yeah. And it does also show, doesn't it, Philip, that Starmer really got the tone wrong. He got the tone wrong because it wasn't just about the timing. It was the fact that he refused to speak to the citizens of the UK during that visit.
It was almost as though he was angry that it had happened, and he just wanted to be able to make political capital out of it. What can I do? Oh God, this has happened. What can I do? I know I'll have a go at the far right, and I'll create the far right so I can use them in future. I don't think I'm being unkind there.
Actually. Well, no, because Philip, sorry to interrupt, but part of my theory, and obviously we don't know this for sure, but my theory is that Starmer was so angry at the reception he got in Southport, it actually sparked part of his decision and his rationale behind deciding to go hard on the far right. Whereas I do not believe that the people who were heckling him in Southport were members of the so-called far right. One of them, Philip, we know for sure, was a best friend of someone whose 9-year-old was stabbed. So actually, it was locals who were just expressing genuine anger.
I think what we see in that footage, Dan, and I've seen it a couple of times, I always think the same thing. Okay, we see Starmer there making an enemy of the British people.
Yes.
We also see the real deep humanity in King Charles. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of King Charles. I adored the late Queen, but I said before, and you said, I was that we were proud when we saw that, and I was proud of the monarchy. I was proud of the response, because it was a human response. It was a simple response, and it was, "How are you?" It had humility, which was precisely the opposite.
Totally. And I hope for Charles, firstly, that it gives him a boost, because I wasn't heartened by what he said about his health. I do think he's suffering very badly. Not too bad. It's hardly a ringing endorsement, is it? So I hope he was boosted by that, but I hope that he also sees that actually he must be a unifying figure. Yes, he likes Keir Starmer a lot. Yes, they hang out a bit privately. He seems to be politically aligned, but actually he needs to be a unifying figure. He needs to keep away from politics and connect with the people in the way that he did today, because as you said, it was emotional and pitch perfect. But look, Angela Levin, stand by. But thank you very much to the brilliant Philip Casale, a great man, eminent cultural historian, of course, academic, author, political commentator, and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum. Hope you will come back very soon.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Now,